The necessary expense of preparing a work of such magnitude for the press must have been a considerable deduction from the price stipulated to be paid for the copyright. I understand that nothing was allowed by the booksellers on that account, and I remember his telling me that a large portion of it having by mistake been written upon both sides of the paper so as to be inconvenient for the compositor, it cost him £20 to have it transcribed upon one side only. He is now to be considered as tugging at his oar, as engaged in a steady, continued course of occupation, sufficient to employ all his time for some years, and which was the best preventative of that constitutional melancholy which was ever lurking upon him, ready to trouble his quiet. But his enlarged and lively mind could not be satisfied without more diversity of employment, and the pleasure of animated relaxation. He therefore not only exerted his talents in occasional composition very different from lexiconography, but formed a club in Ivy Lane, Patersnown Row, with a view to enjoy literary discussion and amuse his evening hours. The members associated with him in this little society were his beloved friend Dr. Richard Bathurst, Mr. Hawkesworth, afterwards well known for his writings, Mr. John Hawkins, an attorney, and a few others of different professions. The attorney, Mr. Hawkins, was afterwards for several years chairman of the Middlesex Justices, and upon occasion of presenting an address to the King, accepted the usual offer of knighthood. He is author of A History of Music and 5 volumes in quarto. By assiduous attendance on Johnson in his last illness, he obtained the office of one of his executors, in consequence of which the booksellers of London employed him to publish an edition of Dr. Johnson's works and to write his life. In the Gentleman's Magazine, for May of this year, 1749, Johnson wrote a Life of Roscommon, with notes, which he afterwards much improved, indented the notes into text, and inserted it amongst his Lives of the English Poets. Mr. Dodsley this year brought out his Preceptor, one of the most valuable books for the improvement of young minds that has appeared in any language. And to this meritorious work Johnson furnished the preface, containing a general sketch of the book, with a short and perspicuous recommendation of each article, and as also the Vision of Theodore the Hermit found in his cell, a most beautiful allegory of human life, under the figure of ascending the mountains of existence. The Bishop of Dromer heard Dr. Johnson say that he thought this was the best thing he ever wrote. In 1749, when Johnson was 40, in January, he published The Vanity of Human Wishes, being the 10th satire of Juvenal imitated. He, I believe, composed it the preceding year. Sir John Hawkins, with solemn inaccuracy, represents this poem as a consequence of the indifferent reception of his tragedy. But the fact is that the poem was published on the 9th of January, and the tragedy was not acted till the 6th of February the following. This is the tragedy you worked on a while ago, I think, that they're talking about here. Irene, I believe it's called. Could be a different one, though, I don't know. Mrs. Johnson, for the sake of country air, had lodgings at Hampstead, to which he resorted occasionally, and there the greatest part, if not the whole, of the imitation was written. The fervid rapidity with which it was produced is scarcely credible. I have heard him say that he composed 70 lines of it in one day, without putting one of them upon paper till they were finished. I remember when I once regretted to him that he had not given us more of Juvenal's satires. He said he probably should give more, for he had them all in his head. by which I understood that he had the originals and correspondence allusions floating in his mind, which he could, when he pleased, embody and render permanent without much labor. Some of them, however, he observed were too gross for imitation. The profits of a single poem, however excellent, appear to have been very small in the last reign, compared with what a publication of the same size has done since been known to yield. Yeah, right. I have mentioned, upon Johnson's own authority, that for his London he had only 10 guineas, and now, after his fame was established, he got for his Vanity of Human Wishes but 5 guineas more, as is proved by an authentic document in my possession. On November 25th of 1748, I received Mr. Dodsley. This is a letter from Johnson proving that he made this much money. November 25th, 1748. I received of Mr. Dodsley 15 guineas, for which I assigned to him the right of copy of an imitation of the 10th satire of Juvenal written by me, reserving to myself the right of printing one edition. Sam Johnson. London, 29 June 1786. A true copy from the original in Dr. Johnson's handwriting, Jas. Dodsley. It will be observed that Johnson reserves to himself the right of printing one edition of this satire, which was his practice upon occasion of the sale of all his writings, it being his fixed intention to publish at some period for his own profit a complete collection of his works. His Vanity of Human Wishes has less of common life but more of a philosophical dignity than his London. More readers, therefore, will be delighted with the pointed spirit of London than with the profound reflection of the Vanity of Human Wishes. Garrick, for instance, that arch enemy of Johnson's, observed in his sprightly manner, with more vivacity than regard to just discrimination, as is usual with wits, when Johnson lived much with the Herveys and saw a good deal of what was passing in life, he wrote his London, which is lively and easy. When he became more retired, he gave us his Vanity of Human Wishes, which is as hard as Greek. Had he gone on to imitate another satire, it would have been as hard as Hebrew. Anyway, but the Vanity of Human Wishes is, in the opinion of the best judges, as high an effort of ethic poetry as any language can show. The instances of variety of disappointment are chosen so judiciously and painted so strongly that the moment they are read they bring conviction to every thinking mind. That of the scholar must have depressed the too sanguine expectations of many an ambitious student. Let me pause here for a long footnote. In this poem, one of the instances mentioned of unfortunate learned men is Lydiat. Here, Lydiat's life and Galileo's end. The history of Lydiat being little known, the following account of him may be acceptable to many of my readers. It appears as a note in the supplement to the Gentleman's Magazine for 1748, in which some passages extracted from Johnson's poem were inserted, and it should have been added in the subsequent editions. A very learned divine and mathematician, Fellow of New College, Oxon, and Rector of Ackerton, near Barbary. He wrote, among many others, a Latin treatise, De Natura Cali, etc., in which he attacked the sentiments of Scaliger and Aristotle, not bearing to hear it urged that some things are true in philosophy and false in divinity. He made above 600 sermons on the harmony of the evangelists. Being unsuccessful in publishing his works, he lay in the prison of Baccardo at Oxford, and in the King's Bench, till Bishop Usher, Dr. Laud, Sir William Boswell, and Dr. Pink released him by payment his debts. He petitioned King Charles I to be sent into Ethiopia, etc., to procure manuscripts. to procure MSS, actually. I don't know what that means. Having spoken in favor of monarchy and bishops, he was plundered by the Parliament forces and twice carried away prisoner from his rectory, and afterwards has not a shirt to shift him in 3 months without he borrowed it, and died very poor in 1646. So anyway, he wrote about that guy, I guess. And then that also wrote a poem of a warrior, Charles of Sweden, which I think is highly finished, a picture as can possibly be convinced or conceived. Were all the other excellencies of this poem annihilated, it must ever have our grateful reverence from its noble conclusion, in which we are consoled with the assurance that happiness may be attained if we apply our hearts to piety. I shall read from this poem now. This ending, my friends. Where then shall hope and fear their object find? Shall dull suspense corrupt the stagnant mind? Must helpless man, in ignorance sedate, roll darkling down the torrent of his fate? Shall no dislike alarm, no wishes rise, no cries attempt the mercy of the skies? Inquire, cease. Petitions yet remain, which heaven may hear, nor deem religion vain. Could be. Oh, I'm not done with it. Still going on with this poem. Still raise for good the supplicating voice, but leave to heaven the measure and the choice. Safe in his hand, whose eyes discerns afar the secret ambush of a specious prayer, a far prayer. Implore his aid, in his decision rest. Secure whatever he gives the best. Yet when the sense of sacred presence fires, and strong devotion to the skies aspires, pour forth thy fervors for a healful mind, obedient passions and a will resigned. For love which scarce collective man can fill, for patience sovereign o'er transmitted ill, for faith which panting for the happier seat counts death king nature's signal for retreat. Counts death kind nature's signal for... I like my version better, but... Those goods for man the laws of heaven ordain, these goods he grants, who grants the power to gain. With these celestial wisdom calms the mind, and makes the happiness she does not find. Wow. It's like Walt Whitman over here. As you can tell, I'm not a real big fan of British poetry back then. It's given me a lot of trauma from undergrad. But anyway, why did I decide to read this book then, you're asking? Because it was there. It's a long fucking book I have, and I gotta read it. Otherwise, what a waste, right? I like the letters, this poetry is terrible. Garrick, being now vested with theatrical power by being manager of Drury Lane Theatre, he kindly and generously made use of it to bring out Jonson's tragedy, which had been long kept back for want of encouragement. But in this benevolent purpose he met with no small difficulty from the temper of Johnson, which could not brook that a drama which he had formed with much study, and had been obliged to keep more than the 9 years of Horace, should be revived and altered at the pleasure of an actor. Yet Garrick knew well that without some alterations it would not fit for the stage. A violent dispute having ensued between them, Garrick applied to the Reverend Dr. Taylor to interpose. Johnson was at first very obstinate. "Sir," said he, "the fellow wants me to make Mahomet run mad, that he may have an opportunity of tossing his hands and kicking his heels." Mahomet was, however, Muhammad was, in fact, played by Mr. Barry, the Demetrius, and Demetrius by Sir Mr. Garrick. But probably at this time the parts were not yet cast. Anyway, Johnson was, however, at last, with difficulty, prevailed on to comply with Garrick's wishes, so as to allow us some changes, but still, there was not enough. I got a feeling this tragedy is real bad. I kind of wish there was more of it in here. Dr. Adams was present the first night of the representation of Irene. Yep, I was right, it is Irene. And gave me the following account. Before the curtain drew up, there were catcalls whistling, which alarmed Johnson's friends. The prologue, which was written by himself in a manly strain, soothed the audience, and the play went off tolerably till it came to the conclusion, when Mrs. Pritchard, the heroine of the piece, was to be strangled upon the stage and was to speak 2 lines with the bowstrings round her neck. The audience cried out, "Murder! Murder!" She several times attempted to speak, but in vain. At last she was obliged to go off the stage alive. Oh, that's funny. Anyway, the expression used by Dr. Adams here was soothe. I should rather think the audience was awed by the extraordinary spirit and dignity of the following lines. This is the prologue. Be this at least his praise, be this his pride. To force applause no modern arts are tried. Should partial catcalls all his hopes confound, he bids no trumpet quell the fatal sound. Should welcome sleep relieve the weary wit, he rolls no thunders o'er the drowsy pit. No snares to captivate the judgment spreads, nor bribes your eyes to prejudice your heads. Unmoved, though witlings sneer and rivals rail, studious to please, yet not ashamed to fail. He scorns the meek address, the suppliant strain, with merit needless, and without it vain. In reason, nature, truth he dares to trust. Ye fops, be silent, and ye wits, be just. That's pretty good. I'll give him that. Anyway, the passage with Mrs. Pritchard dying was afterwards struck out, and she was carried off to be put to death behind the scenes, as the play now has it. The epilogue, as Johnson informed me, was written by Sir William Young. I know not how this play came to be thus graced by the pen of a person then so eminent in the political world. Notwithstanding all the support of such performers as Garrick, Barry, Mrs. Cibber, Mrs. Pritchard, and every advantage of dress and decorations, the tragedy of Irene did not please the public. Mr. Garrick's zeal carried it through for 9 nights, so that the author had his 3 nights' profits, and from a receipt signed by him, now in the hands of Mr. James Dodsley, it appeared that his friend Mr. Robert Dodsley gave him £100 for the copy, with his usual reservation of the right of 1 edition. Irene, considered as a poem, is entitled to the praise of superior excellence. Yeah, sure, Boswell. Analyzed into parts, it will furnish a rich store of noble sentiments, fine imagery, and beautiful language. But it is deficient in pathos, and that delicate power of touching the human feelings, which is the principal end of the drama. Aaron Hill, Volume 2, page 355, in a letter to Mr. Mallet, gives the following account of Irene, which, after having seen it, I was at the anomalous Mr. Johnson's benefit, and found the play his proper representative, strong, sense ungraced by sweetness or decorum. Indeed, Garrick had complained to me, Boswell, that Johnson not only had not the faculty of producing the impressions of tragedy, but that he had not the sensibility to perceive them. His great friend, Mr. Walmsley's prediction that he would turn out a fine tragedy writer was therefore ill-founded. Johnson was wise enough to be convinced that he had not the talents necessary to write successfully for the stage, and never made another attempt in that species of composition. Sad in a way. But he had other merits, I'm sure. It's funny he doesn't like this Garrick guy, since Garrick seems to love him. But that's how it goes, huh? Anyway, bye from Boswell.